Hardly. You see a genuine pastor. Majority are in it for the money and fame. The churches of today are a mockery of what it should be. Most churches are just business centers, a place of extortion and building of generational wealth for selfish reasons. Jake's journey from humble beginnings to a life of deception and eventual downfall serves as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of success through dishonest means ultimately leads to one's own ruin. His story underscores the importance of integrity and the inevitable consequences of exploiting others for personal gain. Before we proceed, please subscribe, like, share, and click on the notification bell for updates. Jake was born in the heart of Lagos, Nigeria, a city known for its bustling streets, high-rise buildings, and endless opportunities. Yet for Jake, life was anything but easy. His parents were farmers who worked tirelessly under the scorching sun, yet they barely made enough to feed their children. He grew up in a small, overcrowded house where every meal was a blessing, and every new day was a battle for survival. Despite his struggles, Jake was an ambitious young man. He excelled in school, determined to break free from the cycle of poverty. He dreamed of becoming a businessman, one who would someday change the fortune of his family. However, after completing his secondary education, reality struck. There was no money for university. As the years passed, Jake watched his peers move on with their lives while he remained stuck. He took up odd jobs to support himself, but the money was never enough. The frustration grew, and soon Jake found himself searching for shortcuts to success. One day, fate intervened when he ran into Jim, an old secondary school friend who had transformed before his very eyes. Jim was no longer the struggling boy from their teenage years. He was now a man of wealth. He wore expensive designer clothes, drove the latest cars, and lived in one of Lagos's finest neighborhoods. The contrast between their lives was stark, and Jake couldn't hide his curiosity. "Jim, is this really you?" Jake exclaimed in disbelief, staring at the flashy car parked beside his friend. Jim smirked. "Yes, my brother. Life has been good to me." Jake wasted no time. "Tell me, how did you do it? What's your secret? I need to leave this suffering behind." Jim studied him for a moment before asking, "Are you ready to do what it takes?" Without hesitation, Jake nodded. "Yes, anything." And with that, Jake unknowingly took his first step down a path he would later regret. Jim wasted no time in introducing Jake to the world of internet fraud. He explained how he made money by scamming unsuspecting victims, mostly through elaborate dating scams. You pretend to love them, make them trust you, and then they send you money, Jim explained. At first, Jake hesitated. The idea of deceiving people didn't sit well with him, but when he saw Jim's bank balance, his reservations quickly disappeared. Desperation made morality a luxury he could no longer afford. Jake moved into Jim's apartment and began his training. He learned how to craft fake profiles, manipulate conversations, and convince victims to send money. He was a fast learner, and before long, he started making his own money. With his newfound wealth, Jake began to enjoy life. Luxury clothes, fine dining, and expensive gadgets. For the first time, he felt powerful. But power came with risks. One evening, Jim burst into their apartment, his face pale with fear. "We have a problem," he said, his voice shaking. "One of my victims reported me, and the police are on my trail." Jake's stomach churned. "What do we do?" "I have to disappear for a while. Lay low. If they catch me, it's over." Days later, Jim was arrested, and his empire crumbled. Jake was left alone, frightened and unsure of his next move. He had tasted wealth, and there was no way he was going back to poverty. He needed a new plan. With Jim in jail, Jake realized he needed a safer way to sustain his wealth. That was when he had a revelation: religion. He had seen how churches grew in Lagos. People gave offerings, believed in miracles, and trusted their pastors without question. If he could convince them that he was a man of God, he could build a new source of wealth. Using part of his fraudulent money, Jake rented a small space and named it End Time Reconciliation Church. He studied the Bible, memorized verses, and crafted a compelling story of redemption. "Brethren, I was once lost," he preached passionately. "I was deep in sin, scamming people, but the Lord called me to repentance. He has sent me to guide you to salvation." His story resonated with people. They saw him as a living testimony of God's grace. The congregation grew, and so did the donations. Before long, Jake had amassed enough money to buy an acre of land and build a grand church auditorium. He lived like a king, driving the latest cars and wearing the finest suits. He had transformed from a scammer into a celebrated man of God. But beneath his righteous facade, darkness lurked. With power came temptation. Jake, now revered as Pastor Jake Orr, began using his influence for selfish gains. He lured women, both single and married, into secret affairs, exploiting their trust in him. Several women became pregnant with his children, but he forced them to undergo abortions to avoid scandals. And if that wasn't enough, Jake began staging fake miracles. He paid actors to pretend they were sick, and in front of the congregation, he would miraculously heal them. The more miracles he performed, the more people came, and the more money he made. Jake believed he was untouchable. But arrogance blinds the foolish, and his day of reckoning was approaching. One fateful Sunday morning, while the congregation waited for their beloved pastor to arrive, a group of strangers entered the church. They walked confidently to the pulpit and held up official documents. "This church building now belongs to us," one of them declared. "Pastor Jake sold it to us and has disappeared." Gasps filled the air. The congregation was thrown into chaos. People scrambled to call Jake, but his number was unreachable. Hours later, someone managed to get through to him. His voice was disturbingly calm. "Brethren, God has led me to another mission. May the Lord bless you all." And with that, he was gone. Jake had sold the church, liquidated all assets, and fled the country with his family. His entire journey, from fraudster to pastor, had been one grand scheme. The congregation was devastated. Some wept, others cursed his name. But in the end, they were left with nothing but betrayal. Jake arrived in Ghana under a different name, living in a high-end neighborhood with the money he had stolen. His lavish lifestyle continued as he invested in new scams, setting up offshore accounts and laundering his wealth. He believed he had escaped the consequences of his past actions. However, paranoia followed him like a shadow. Every knock on the door made his heart race. He switched phones constantly and avoided cameras. His wife, who had initially enjoyed the wealth, began to question his morality. "Jake, how long can we run?" she asked one evening, staring at their children who were oblivious to their father's crimes. But Jake, blinded by greed, dismissed her concerns. "As long as I have money, we are safe," he replied, pouring himself another glass of imported whiskey. Jake's overconfidence led to his downfall. A former church member who had tracked him down reported his location to the authorities. Interpol got involved, working alongside Nigerian security forces to bring him to justice. One evening, as Jake lounged by his private pool, sirens blared. Officers surrounded his mansion. "Jake, you are under arrest for fraud, deception, and financial misappropriation," an officer announced. Jake attempted to flee through the back gate, but it was too late. He was handcuffed and taken away in disgrace. His wife and children watched in shock as he was shoved into a police van, their once glorious lifestyle crumbling within minutes. Jake's trial was the talk of Nigeria. News channels covered every detail, exposing his years of deception. Former church members, women he had exploited, and those who had donated their life savings testified against him. He was supposed to be a man of God, but he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. One woman cried in court. The evidence was overwhelming. Video recordings of fake miracles surfaced, bank records traced his fraudulent transactions, and his betrayal of faith was dissected for the world to see. In a final attempt to save himself, Jake tried to beg for mercy, claiming he had repented. But the judge saw through his performance. "You manipulated faith for personal gain and shattered lives. You will face the full consequences of your actions," he declared. Jake was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. Prison was a harsh reality for Jake. Gone were the days of luxury and power. He was now just another inmate, stripped of status and influence. The food was barely edible, the beds hard, and the walls closing in on him. He spent his days reflecting on his choices, reliving his mistakes. One day, a fellow inmate handed him a Bible. "Maybe you should actually read it this time," the man said before walking away. For the first time in years, Jake truly read the scriptures, not as a tool for manipulation, but as a man searching for redemption. He began counseling younger inmates, warning them about the dangers of greed and deceit. Though the world had condemned him, Jake hoped that one day he could atone for his sins. Years later, Jake was released from prison, now an old, frail man. Lagos had changed, but one thing remained. The story of Pastor Jake was still told in whispers and sermons across the country. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how greed could lead even the most promising men to destruction. Jake, now living in isolation, spent his remaining days in a small, humble home, away from the limelight. He would often watch young pastors preach on television, wondering if they, too, would be tempted by power. The story of Jake was not forgotten, for in the end, no matter how far a man runs, the truth will always catch up with him. The tale of Jake serves as a powerful warning against greed, deception, and the abuse of power. It highlights how shortcuts to success often lead to devastating consequences. True success is built on honesty, integrity, and hard work, while lies and corruption will always catch up with those who rely on them. No matter how far one tries to escape, the truth will always prevail, and justice will be served in the end.